It was a Thursday night and I was meeting up with my friend Dave for dinner. We used to do this thing where we'd try out different restaurants in the city. That night, Dave suggested a place I'd never heard of before. He said he found it on some foodie blog and it was supposed to be this hidden gem. The restaurant was called La Mystique, and it was in a part of town I didn't go to often. The area wasn't sketchy or anything, just a bit out of the way. When I got there, I noticed the place had this old-world charm. The exterior was kind of worn down, but it had these big ornate windows and a sign that looked like it hadn't been changed since the 60s. It was almost like stepping back in time. I walked in, and immediately, I felt something was off. The restaurant was dimly lit, with these old-fashioned chandeliers that gave off a soft, yellowish glow. There were only a few tables, most of them empty. Dave was already there, sitting at a corner table near the back. He waved me over, looking excited. I sat down and greeted Dave. He seemed completely unfazed by the weird atmosphere. We made small talk for a bit, then a waitress came over to take our order. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with this blank expression on her face. She barely made eye contact and spoke in a monotone voice. It was creepy. We ordered our food, and while we waited, Dave kept raving about how great the place was supposed to be. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and just enjoy the night. The food finally arrived, and to be fair, it was really good. I started to relax a bit, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. Halfway through our meal, the lights flickered. It was just for a second, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy again. Dave didn't seem to notice. He was too busy talking about some new project at work. I glanced around the room and noticed that the elderly couple and the woman hadn't reacted to the flickering lights either. They just kept eating, like nothing had happened. After we finished eating, Dave suggested we get dessert. I wasn't really in the mood, but he insisted, saying the place was famous for their desserts. So, we ordered a couple of things to share. While we waited, I excused myself to go to the restroom. The restroom was down a narrow hallway at the back of the restaurant. As I walked down the hall, I got this weird sense of déjà vu, like I'd been there before. The hallway was lined with old photos of what looked like the restaurant in its early days. Black and white pictures of people dining, waitstaff serving food, that sort of thing. One photo caught my eye. It was a group photo of the staff, taken in what looked like the 1950s. There was something familiar about one of the faces, but I couldn't quite place it. I finally reached the restroom and went inside. It was clean, but had this old, musty smell. As I washed my hands, I looked at myself in the mirror and tried to shake off the weird feeling I'd had all night. I splashed some water on my face and took a deep breath. When I stepped back into the hallway, the lights flickered again. This time, they went out completely for a few seconds before coming back on. The hallway seemed longer than before, like it had stretched while I was in the restroom. I hurried back to the table, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. When I got back, Dave was already digging into the desserts. He had this big grin on his face, like nothing in the world could bother him. I sat down and tried one of the desserts. It was amazing, just like he'd said. For a moment I forgot about the weirdness and just enjoyed the food. But then, something strange happened. The woman at the other table got up and left, but she didn't go out the front door. She walked towards the back of the restaurant, disappearing into the same hallway I'd just come from. I watched her go, feeling a chill run down my spine. After a while, Dave and I finished our desserts and decided it was time to leave. As we were paying the bill, I glanced around the room one last time. The elderly couple was still there, still eating in silence. The waitress who had served us was standing by the kitchen door, staring at us with that same blank expression. We left the restaurant, and as soon as we stepped outside, I felt a huge sense of relief. The cool night air was like a wake-up call, clearing my head. Dave was still raving about the food, saying we had to come back again soon. I just nodded, not really paying attention. A few days later, I tried to find the restaurant online. I wanted to read more about it, see if anyone else had felt the same weird vibe I did. But when I searched for La Mystique, I couldn't find anything. No reviews, no blog posts, nothing. It was like the place didn't exist. I called Dave and asked him if he knew anything about the restaurant, like how he'd found it. He said he couldn't remember, just that he'd read about it somewhere. That struck me as odd. Dave has a great memory and he's usually really good with details. I decided to go back to the area and see if I could find the restaurant again. Maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing. But when I got to where the restaurant should have been, it wasn't there. In its place was an old boarded-up building. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I stood there, staring at the building, trying to make sense of it all. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I'd been there, eaten the food, seen the people, but now it was like the restaurant had vanished into thin air. I went back home feeling more confused than ever. A few weeks later, I was cleaning out my closet when I found an old photo album. I started flipping through it, reminiscing about old times. Then I came across a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of my grandparents at a restaurant, taken sometime in the 1950s. They were young, smiling at the camera. Behind them, I could see the same chandeliers, the same ornate windows. It was La Mystique. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could a restaurant from the 1950s still be around, looking exactly the same? And why had it disappeared now? I tried to find more information about the restaurant, but every lead came up empty. It was like it had been wiped from existence. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. I was in my late 20s and working as a line cook in this fancy restaurant in the heart of the city. It wasn't just any restaurant though. It was one of those places where you'd have to book a table months in advance, and the menu was always changing based on the chef's whim, the maison. I had just moved to the city and was trying to make a name for myself in the culinary world. The job was tough, with long hours and high pressure, but it was worth it for the experience and the chance to learn from the best. Plus, the pay wasn't bad, and I needed the money. One night things took a turn. It started like any other busy evening. We were packed to the brim, every table occupied, and the kitchen was a madhouse. The head chef Marco was barking orders, and we were all moving at a breakneck pace to keep up. The orders were coming in faster than we could handle, and the tension was high. Around 8 p.m., a couple walked in. They didn't have a reservation, which was odd because nobody got into the maison without one. The hostess, Jenna, tried to explain this, but they insisted. They were well-dressed, the man in a sharp suit and the woman in a sleek black dress, and they had an air of importance about them. After some back and forth, Jenna caved and found them a table. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too busy chopping vegetables and searing steaks to care about one more couple. But then I noticed something strange. As soon as they sat down, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. It was like the air became thicker, and there was this weird, unsettling energy. I shook it off, figuring I was just stressed and overworked. The couple ordered an extravagant meal, the works. They wanted the finest wine, the most expensive dishes, and they didn't even glance at the prices. Marco, always up for a challenge, took it as an opportunity to show off. He started prepping their meal with extra care, and I was tasked with assisting him. About halfway through preparing their main course, Marco handed me a tray with a small glass vial on it. He said, "Take this to the couple," not looking up from his cutting board. I was confused. I asked, "What is it?" He snapped, "Just do it." So I took the vial to their table. When I got there, the man looked at me with these cold, piercing eyes. He took the vial without a word, opened it, and poured its contents into his wine. Then he handed it back to me and said, "Tell Marco we'll need another." I nodded and went back to the kitchen, feeling a chill run down my spine. I handed the empty vial to Marco, who didn't seem surprised at all. He just nodded and continued cooking. As the night went on, things got weirder. The couple barely spoke to each other, but they kept ordering more food and more wine. And every time they finished a dish, Marco would give me another vial to take to them. It was always the same. They'd pour it into their wine, drink it, and ask for another. Around 10 p.m., the restaurant was starting to empty out. The couple was still there though, and they didn't seem to be in any hurry to leave. Marco called me over and handed me a small, ornate box. He said, "Take this to them," his voice tense. I walked over to their table and placed the box in front of them. The woman opened it and smiled. Inside was a single, small white pill. She took it out and placed it on her tongue, then took a sip of her wine. The man did the same. I couldn't take it anymore. I asked, "What's in the vials?" my voice shaking. The man looked at me with a smirk. He said, "Curiosity killed the cat, but since you're so interested, why don't you have a taste?" He handed me the empty vial. I stared at it, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get out of there and never look back, but another part of me was too curious, too drawn to the mystery of it all. Before I could make a decision, Marco called me back to the kitchen. I handed him the empty vial and he gave me a hard look. "Stay out of their business," he warned. "Just do your job." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The couple eventually left, leaving behind an exorbitant tip. Marco locked up the restaurant and we all went home. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was racing with questions. What was in those vials? Who were that couple? And why did Marco seem to know them? The next day, I arrived at work early. Marco was already there, prepping for the day. I decided to confront him. I asked Marco what was in those vials. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. He said, "You don't want to know." "Yes, I do," I insisted. "I need to know." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "All right, but you have to promise me you won't tell anyone." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Those vials," he said slowly, "contained a very rare and expensive ingredient. It's called Elixir of the Gods. It's supposed to enhance the flavor of the food and give the diner an extraordinary experience." I frowned. "But why all the secrecy?" "Because it's illegal," Marco admitted. "It's a highly controlled substance, and only a select few people in the world have access to it. The couple last night, they're some of our most important clients. They pay a lot of money for that experience." I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that it wasn't something more sinister, but fear because I had been part of something illegal. I asked, "What happens if we get caught?" Marco shrugged. "We won't, as long as you keep your mouth shut." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. From that day on, things at the Maison were different. The atmosphere was always tense and there were more and more of these special clients showing up. Each time it was the same routine: the vials, the pills, the secrecy. One night, about a month after the couple's visit, things came to a head. It was another busy evening and we were all rushing to keep up with the orders. Marco handed me a tray with 3 vials this time. He said, "Take these to table 7. I nodded and made my way to the table. It was another couple, dressed to the nines with the same cold, piercing eyes. I handed them the vials, and they performed the same ritual, pouring the contents into their wine and drinking it down. As I turned to leave, the woman grabbed my arm. She said, "Stay," her voice commanding. I froze, unsure of what to do. The man looked at me and smiled. He said, holding out a glass of wine, "Join us for a drink." I hesitated, but something in their eyes compelled me to sit down. They handed me a glass, and I took a small sip. The wine was rich and full-bodied, but there was something else, a bitter metallic taste that lingered on my tongue. The woman leaned in close. She asked, her voice a whisper, "Do you know what you just drank?" I shook my head, my heart pounding. She said, "It's not just an elixir, it's something much more powerful." I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I asked, "What do you mean?" My voice barely audible. The man's smile widened. "You've just ingested a very rare and ancient substance," he said. "It's known as the blood of the immortals." My mind was reeling. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman laughed softly. "You're in over your head," she said. "But don't worry, you're one of us now." I stood up, my legs shaking. I said, backing away from the table, "I need to go." The man's eyes glinted with amusement. "You can't leave," he said. "Not now, not ever." I stumbled back into the kitchen, my head spinning. Marco looked up, his eyes widening in alarm. He asked, "What happened?" I couldn't find the words. I just shook my head and ran out of the restaurant. That was the last time I ever set foot in the Maison. I quit my job the next day and moved to a different city, trying to put the whole experience behind me. But I couldn't escape the feeling that I had been part of something much bigger and darker than I could comprehend. Every now and then, I see glimpses of that couple on the street, in a crowded subway, at a coffee shop. They never approach me, but their presence is enough to send chills down my spine. I've tried to forget, to move on with my life. But the memory of that night, of those vials and that strange, bitter wine haunts me to this day. and I can't shake the feeling that no matter where I go, they're always watching. It was this small, family-owned restaurant in a quiet part of town, the kind of place that had been around forever, serving the same regulars for decades. The food was good, and the pay wasn't bad, so I took the job as a waiter while I figured out what to do with my life. My first day there, everything seemed pretty normal. I met the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Hastings, an older couple who seemed nice enough. They had this almost old-school charm about them, always smiling and making small talk with the customers. The rest of the staff was a mixed bag. Some had been there for years, others like me were just passing through. The first few weeks went by without incident. I got the hang of things, made a few friends among the staff, and even started to enjoy the routine. But then, things started to get weird. It was a slow Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed it. I was cleaning tables and I noticed this guy sitting in the corner booth. He was older, probably in his 60s, with this blank look on his face. He'd been sitting there for hours, not ordering anything, just staring out the window. I mentioned it to one of my co-workers, Sarah, and she just shrugged it off. "Don't worry about him," she said. "He's just a regular. Comes in every day, sits there for a few hours, and leaves. Never causes any trouble." I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the guy. Over the next few days, I noticed him more and more, always in the same spot, always with that same vacant expression. One evening, I was closing up the restaurant with another coworker, Mike. We were wiping down the tables when I noticed the guy's booth was still occupied. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. I asked, "Hey, Mike, you ever wonder what's up with that guy?" Mike looked over and sighed. "Yeah, he's a bit strange, but like Sarah said, he's harmless. Mr. Hastings told me once that he's just lonely or something. Lonely or not, there was something about him that made me uneasy. But I figured if the owners were okay with him hanging around, it wasn't my place to say anything." Then one night, everything changed. It was a Friday and the place was busier than usual. We had a full house and I was running around like crazy trying to keep up with orders. Amid the chaos, I noticed the guy in the corner booth again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. There was a woman sitting across from him, talking animatedly. He was just sitting there, staring at her with that same blank expression. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally found someone to talk to, but something about the scene didn't sit right with me. The woman's face was flushed and she kept glancing around nervously. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but it looked like she was pleading with him. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop glancing over at them. Eventually, I saw the woman get up and leave, her face pale and her hands shaking. The guy just stayed there, staring after her. That night, after closing up, I asked Mrs. Hastings about it. "Do you know anything about that guy in the corner booth, the one who was here tonight with that woman?" She gave me a strange look. "What woman?" "There was a woman sitting with him tonight," I insisted. She looked upset. Mrs. Hastings shook her head. "I didn't see anyone with him." "Are you sure?" I nodded, but she just gave me a pat on the shoulder and told me not to worry about it. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more strange things. The guy in the booth seemed to be there more often, and he always had that same blank look. Customers who sat near him would get up and leave suddenly, often without finishing their meals. Some of them looked scared, others just confused. One night I was taking a break in the back when I overheard Mr. Hastings talking to one of the regulars. They were discussing the guy in the booth and Mr. Hastings sounded worried. "I don't know what to do about him," he was saying. "He's not doing anything wrong, but he's scaring away customers. I don't want to call the cops, but..." The regular just nodded sympathetically. "Maybe you should talk to him, see if he needs help." Mr. Hastings sighed. "Yeah, maybe." The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I waited until the guy was in his usual spot, then approached his table. "Hi there," I said, trying to sound friendly. "Can I get you anything?" He didn't respond, just kept staring out the window. I tried again. "Sir, can I get you something to eat or drink?" Still nothing. I was about to walk away when he suddenly turned and looked at me. His eyes were dark and empty, like he wasn't really seeing me. He said in a low, monotone voice, "I'm waiting for someone." I replied, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, okay, well if you need anything, just let me know." I walked away, feeling more unsettled than ever. There was something seriously wrong with that guy, but I couldn't figure out what. A few days later, Sarah pulled me aside. She said, "Hey, you won't believe what I heard," glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. I asked, "What's up?" "I heard Mr. Hastings talking to the cops last night," she whispered. "Apparently that guy in the booth? He's been reported missing by his family." My jaw dropped. "What? How is that possible? He's here every day." Sarah nodded. "I know, it's crazy, but that's what I heard. The cops are looking into it." I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. If the guy was missing, then who the hell was sitting in that booth every day? That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the guy, his empty eyes, and the woman who'd seemed so scared. There was something going on, something that didn't make any sense. The next day I went to work feeling like I was in a fog. The guy was in his usual spot, but I avoided looking at him. I just couldn't deal with it. Around lunchtime, the restaurant suddenly went quiet. I looked up and saw a group of police officers walking in, led by a detective. They went straight to the guy's booth and started talking to him. He just sat there, staring at them with that same blank look. After a few minutes, they helped him to his feet and led him out of the restaurant. The detective stayed behind and spoke with Mr. Hastings for a while. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Mr. Hastings looked upset. After the cops left, I approached Mr. Hastings. I asked, "What happened?" He sighed heavily. "They're taking him in for questioning. Apparently he's been involved in some incidents around town. People going missing, that sort of thing." My blood ran cold. "You think he's responsible?" Mr. Hastings shook his head. "I don't know. But the cops seem to think he might know something." The restaurant felt different after that. The guy's absence left a weird void, like something was missing. The regulars started coming back, but there was this underlying tension that hadn't been there before. A few weeks later we heard the news. The guy had been found dead in his cell. They said it was suicide, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. One night I was closing up with Sarah and Mike when we started talking about it. Sarah asked, "Do you think he really did it?" Mike shook his head. "I don't know, but I do know that things haven't been the same since he showed up." I nodded in agreement. There was something about that guy that had unsettled all of us, something that went beyond just his strange behavior. As we were leaving, I glanced back at the empty restaurant. For a moment I thought I saw someone sitting in the corner booth, but when I blinked, the figure was gone. I shook my head, trying to clear the lingering unease. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. But deep down, I knew there was something about that restaurant, something that would always stay with me. Maybe it was just the memory of the guy in the booth, or maybe it was something more. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something bigger, something darker. I quit my job at the restaurant a few months later. It wasn't just because of the guy, but it definitely played a part. I needed to get away, to put some distance between myself and that place. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I see an empty booth in a restaurant. I wonder if there's someone else out there, sitting and waiting, with that same blank look in their eyes. And I wonder if anyone else feels the same chill that I do, remembering the guy in the corner booth who was always waiting for someone who never came.